On Wednesday in Las Vegas, the President of the United States stood in front of cameras and called Canada's leadership nasty. Quote, Canada's nasty, they are. They're nasty, end quote, Trump said. Quote, I love the people, but they're nasty. Nasty leadership, end quote. That's not a policy statement. That's not a tariff announcement. That's a sitting U.S. president using a personal insult against the government of America's largest trading partner, 19 days before a 50% tariff deadline both countries are supposedly still negotiating their way out of. Mark Carney's response wasn't an insult back, it was a number. If you've been watching this channel's coverage of Section 338, the steelworkers' letter, or the Keystone pipeline Trump himself just signed back to life, you already know this trade war runs on two very different registers, Washington's loud one and Ottawa's quiet one. What happened this week is the clearest head-to-head test of those two registers yet, and it lands at the worst possible moment for anyone hoping this negotiation cools down before the next deadline hits. Subscribe before we get into it, because the number Carney used doesn't just answer Trump, it turns his own tariff into evidence against him. And drop a comment when you're done. When one side responds to a personal insult with a fact instead of an insult of its own, is that restraint or is that the sharper play? Let's get into it. Start with exactly what was said, because the tone matters as much as the content here. Trump's comments came during a public appearance in Las Vegas, unprompted by any specific new development, just a president venting about a negotiation that clearly isn't going the way he'd like. He didn't name Carney specifically. He didn't cite a policy disagreement. He called the leadership of a G7 ally and a $19 billion a year trading partner nasty twice, in the same breath as saying he loves the people who elected that leadership. This isn't actually new behavior, it's a pattern. Back in January 2026, at the World Economic Forum, after Carney pushed back publicly on U.S. trade policy, Trump's response then was, quote, Canada lives because of the United States, end quote, a blunt assertion of dependency dressed up as a compliment. 7 months later, the register hasn't changed. What's changed is what Canada is doing about it. Carney's reply, given directly to reporters, didn't engage the insult at all. Quote, this is a tough negotiation, end quote, he said. Quote, this is a question of Canadian jobs. It's a question of the future of Canadian businesses, end quote. He confirmed the talks have gotten nasty, using Trump's own word back, but pointedly attached it to the negotiation itself, not to any individual. Then he did the thing that actually matters for anyone trying to figure out who's winning this exchange. He cited a number. U.S. tariffs on Canadian aluminum, Carney said, have already driven aluminum prices up 58% inside the United States. Sit with that number for a second, because it's doing more work than it looks like at first. This channel has already covered how the Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum got doubled around the same period the steelworkers' letter went out to Washington. Those tariffs were sold as protection for American industry. A 58% domestic price spike is not what protection looks like from the inside. It's the cost of the tariff landing on American manufacturers, construction firms, and ultimately American consumers, who now pay more for anything built with aluminum, cars, cans, aircraft parts, wiring, before a single ounce of it crosses back over the border as a finished good. Carney didn't argue that the tariffs are unfair to Canada. He pointed out with a specific figure that they're not even working the way Washington claims they're supposed to. Break that 58% down into what it actually touches, because aluminum isn't a niche industrial input, it's in the daily purchase list of almost every American household. It's the metal in a beverage can, in the body panels and wheels of a huge share of American-built vehicles, in the siding and window frames on new construction, in the fuselage components of aircraft still assembled in the U.S. When the raw input for all of that jumps by more than half inside the country imposing the tariff, that cost doesn't disappear. It moves down the supply chain to whoever buys the finished product, an American consumer who has no vote in this negotiation, and in most cases, no idea a Canadian trade dispute is the reason their grocery bill or their new car creeped up. That's the exact mechanism the steelworkers' own letter to Greer was warning about back in July, stated here as a hard, specific number instead of a general warning. Here's the deadline sitting underneath all of this. August 19th, 2026, the 50% Section 338 tariff on Canadian autos, dairy, and alcohol, roughly $20 billion of annual trade, takes effect if nothing changes between now and then. This channel has already walked through the legal mechanics of that specific tariff 3 times, the missing legal step, the lawsuit that hasn't come, the countdown itself, so this isn't a fourth explainer of the same law. What's actually new this week is what Canada is asking for on the way into that deadline, and it's a bigger ask than anything covered so far. Quote, Canada's been very clear. We want all 232s addressed, all strategic sectors, end quote. Carney said on August 5th. Not just the narrow autos dairy alcohol basket Section 338 covers, all of it, steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, the full list of goods currently sitting under Section 232 tariffs, on the table in one negotiation instead of fought over piecemeal, one proclamation at a time. That's Canada raising the stakes of its own ask at the exact moment Trump is escalating his rhetoric, not backing down in response to it. Strategic sectors isn't a vague phrase here either. It has a specific list attached. Beyond steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber, reporting on the broader negotiation has Trump's side pushing for tougher rules of origin covering defense, mining, and advanced manufacturing too, the same category of critical minerals and semiconductor-adjacent industries this channel has been tracking as a genuinely untouched angle in this trade war. Tougher rules of origin means exactly what it sounds like, raising the bar on how much of a product's actual value has to be made in North America before it qualifies for tariff-free treatment under the existing trade agreement, closing a loophole rather than opening one. If that provision lands the way it's currently being discussed, it would touch a much wider slice of the Canadian economy than autos, dairy, and alcohol ever did on their own. Which is exactly why Canada's counter-ask is to get everything addressed in one negotiation instead of one sector at a time. It's also worth remembering this isn't the first time a hard deadline in this trade war has moved, or at least been treated as more negotiable than it first appeared. This channel has already had to correct one deadline that turned out to be stale data mistaken for a live event, and separately traced how a different tariff authority expired the exact same instant a new one took over. A genuinely strange, bureaucratic coincidence nobody else covered. The pattern across this entire saga is that deadlines in this fight function as leverage points as much as hard stops, dates that concentrate negotiating pressure right up until the moment they either land or get quietly adjusted. August 19th deserves to be watched with that history in mind, not treated as a foregone certainty in either direction. There's a real concrete proposal behind that ask, not just a talking point. Canadian and American negotiators, including U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, the same official the steelworkers' letter was addressed to, have reportedly been discussing a revived tariff quota structure for Canadian steel and aluminum. A set volume of Canadian metal would qualify for a lower duty rate, with anything above that quota still facing the full tariff. Think of it less like a light switch and more like a toll booth with a discount pass. The first truckload of a given month moves through cheap. Everything after that pays full price. The specific volume threshold hasn't been made public as of this recording. That detail is still being negotiated, but the structure itself is a meaningfully different conversation than the yes or no cliff edge Section 338 represents. As of Greer's office, there's still no public confirmation the quota framework has actually been finalized. Worth noting, given this channel already tracked his office's continued silence on the steelworkers' letter itself weeks earlier, a second data point suggesting USTR is moving slowly and deliberately on Canada-specific requests generally, not just this one. This wouldn't even be the first time a structure like this has replaced a flat tariff between these two countries. Back in 2019, during Trump's first term, his original steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada were lifted specifically in exchange for a surge monitoring arrangement rather than staying in place as a blanket wall, part of the run-up to getting the current trade agreement ratified in the first place. A quota now would be a return to that same basic playbook. tariff relief with a limit attached, instead of the current all-or-nothing 50% cliff. Carney also did something worth noticing precisely because he didn't do it. Asked about retaliation, he confirmed Canada retains options if the new tariffs go ahead, but declined to specify what they are. He has, separately and explicitly, ruled out weaponizing Canadian oil exports as one of those options, prioritizing Canada's reputation as a reliable energy supplier over any short-term leverage a supply threat might buy. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same restraint that was actually already paying off 3 months earlier. This channel covered how Carney offered Trump the revival of the Keystone pipeline the U.S. itself had killed twice, tied to relief on these exact steel and aluminum tariffs, and got a presidential signature on it in April. Threatening to cut off oil supply would have undercut that entire play. Keeping the reputation intact is what makes the next offer credible. Line up what that actually produces across this year, and a pattern shows up that's easy to miss watching each story in isolation. Carney gets personally insulted at the World Economic Forum in January, told Canada only lives because of the United States, and doesn't escalate. By October, he's in the White House offering Trump the one thing his own administration wanted badly enough to reverse 2 of its own canceled decisions. And by April, he has a signed presidential permit reviving a pipeline the U.S. itself had killed twice, tied directly to these same steel and aluminum tariffs. In July, it isn't even a Canadian official who pushes back, it's the presidents of 2 major American industrial unions, representing 1.45 million members, writing directly to Trade Representative Greer to say Canada was never the problem. Around the same window, Carney separately vowed Canada would counter U.S. auto tariffs specifically, without ever describing what that counter would look like in public before it happens. Then, in August, Trump calls Canadian leadership nasty, and Carney's on-record response is a domestic U.S. price statistic, not a counter-insult. 4 separate flashpoints across 8 months, 4 calm, fact-first, or quietly prepared responses from the Canadian side, and Canada has come away from every one of them with something concrete to show for it. A signature, a domestic ally, an unspecified but stated intent to respond, and now a number that does its arguing for it. None of that means Canada has actually won anything yet on the specific question that matters most right now. No formal reduction in the 50% steel and aluminum tariff has been announced. No exemption from the August 19th Section 338 deadline has been confirmed. The tariff quota proposal is reportedly still being discussed, not signed, and Trump's own rhetoric this week suggests a president who is, at minimum, not in a mood to hand out easy concessions. Calling this settled in Canada's favor before August 19th actually arrives would be exactly the kind of overclaiming this channel doesn't do. There's also a real question of whether the insult itself weakens Trump's own position more than it strengthens it, worth asking plainly rather than assuming either way. A public insult aimed at a negotiating partner's leadership, made without a specific policy demand attached to it, gives Carney's government nothing concrete to actually respond to, no proposal to reject, no term to counter, just a mood to decline engaging with. That's precisely what happened here. There was no insult-shaped hole for Carney to fill, so he filled the moment with a statistic instead. And the statistic is now the part of this exchange getting quoted back in Canadian press coverage, not Trump's line. Whether that was the outcome Trump wanted going into Wednesday is very much an open question. So here's what actually determines how this specific round ends. First, watch whether the tariff quota structure for steel and aluminum gets finalized before August 19th, or whether it quietly dies the way plenty of trial balloon proposals do in this trade war. Second, watch whether all strategic sectors stays Canada's actual negotiating position all the way to the deadline, or gets narrowed back down under pressure, since a broader ask that survives contact with a hard deadline is a much stronger data point than one that doesn't. Third, watch Trump's rhetoric specifically over the next 2 weeks, since a president who escalates personal insults right before a deadline is sending a very different signal than one who's actually preparing to sign a deal. And fourth, watch whether Canada names its unspecified retaliation options at all or keeps them off the table the way it's kept the oil threat off the table, since restraint has been the one consistent thread running through every one of Canada's wins so far this year. Here's what this actually means for you if you're on either side of that border. If you buy anything built with aluminum in the United States, cars, canned goods, aircraft parts, you're already paying part of that 58% price increase, whether or not you've ever thought about a Canadian trade dispute. If you're a home builder or a home buyer on the American side, Canadian softwood lumber sitting under the same Section 232 umbrella means higher framing costs are quietly baked into that math too, a tariff most buyers will never see itemized on a closing statement but will absolutely feel in the final price. If you work in Canadian steel, aluminum, auto manufacturing, or lumber, the next 2 weeks decide whether your sector gets folded into a broader deal or stays exposed to a piecemeal fight, one proclamation at a time. This isn't background noise for either country's economy. It's a live input into prices and jobs on both sides of a border currently being negotiated in public, one press conference at a time. Here's the actual scoreboard as of this week, stated plainly. Trump used a personal insult in public. Carney used a verified domestic U.S. statistic in response, and didn't need to raise his voice to do it. That's not a coincidence. And by this point in the year, on this channel, it isn't even a surprise. It's a pattern with a signed pipeline permit and a steelworkers letter already sitting behind it as evidence. Whether that pattern holds through August 19th is the actual test still ahead. If you want the version of this trade war that tracks who's actually landing points, instead of just who's raising their voice the loudest, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and get that comment in. When the louder side reaches for an insult and the quieter side reaches for a fact, which one do you think is actually losing that exchange? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one.